Welcome to the Wednesday Honors Luncheon series.
First of all, let me welcome you all for being in our last luncheon of the semester. So we are ending on a high note with the presence of Carla Kaplan, and now Director Gellens will introduce her properly.
In spite of the weather, it's a pleasure to have
Yeah.
you here today. There's a brief backstory to my inviting you, and that is when I was a freshman in college out in Indiana in 1968, there was a course coded as EXP, Afro-American Literature, experimental.
Yeah, EXP, yeah.
Right. And it was in that course that I read many of the writers you studied. Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois. In any case, and I kept at it over the years. It's not my field of specialization. As you know, my PhD is in Islamic history. But my interest was rekindled when I was past 3 semesters teaching United States history at City College, and I was able to teach this stuff once again a little bit. In any case, when I saw the reviews of your latest book, Miss Anne in Harlem, I said, this is someone I'd really like to invite to come down. And I don't have time to go through all of your accomplishments here, and they are many. Carla currently is a professor of English at Northeastern University, but this year has been on leave at Wellesley College. This is not her first book. Among her previous books is Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters, the first published collection of the major Afro-American women's letters, which is to use the word here, a melding of biography, cultural history, and correspondence, which drew on nearly 50 archives. She'll speak to us today about what is, I assume, a relatively new interest, which is the role of white women in the Harlem Renaissance, which reached its peak around 1930. Although now people are starting to talk about extending it a little bit more with the discovery of certain manuscripts at Columbia and elsewhere. In any case, the floor is yours, and we welcome you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming down in this awful weather.
Thanks for coming out. I know this is a really busy time in this semester, and I want to thank Professor Gellens for inviting me. We've had an extended and a very, very gracious correspondence, and it's really a joy to be here. This is actually my first time at Yeshiva University, so I'm really glad to be here. The talk I'm going to give is not just a book talk, but it draws from this book, Miss Anne in Harlem, which is a consideration of a set of racial crossovers and cross-identifications. I promised Professor Gellens I'd keep it to about 35 minutes so we have time for some questions. So there just may be a point at which I simply break, because the talk, as written, may be a little longer than that. The book is called Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance, and I need to say a couple words about the phrase Miss Anne. Miss Anne is a term that, as far as we can determine, was developed many years prior to the Harlem Renaissance by black female Southern domestic workers to refer to their bosses. So these were women who were stuck in the homes of the white women they worked for, stuck in their kitchens, 12, 14, 15, sometimes 17 hours a day. Now, they could not afford to disrespect, disregard, or dismiss those white women employers to their faces, and behind their backs they would dismiss them as a category. They would refer to them as Miss Anne. When the women I write about in this book went to Black Harlem, they were determined not to just be casual tourists. There's been a lot of work done on casual white tourists to Harlem. Harlem, as Langston Hughes put it, was very much in vogue throughout the 1920s. These were not white women who were part of the Harlem Vogue. They wanted to be serious participants in a movement defined as a black racial, political, cultural movement. So it was a very unlikely thing for white women to try to do. one of the problems they faced is that the black community was very apt, for good historical reasons, to dismiss them as Miss Anne and to assume that they could not contribute in a meaningful and productive way to the black community. So they faced, on the one hand, a white community that said to them, don't you dare do this. And if you do this, if you go to Black Harlem, seriously, we're done with you. You can't come home again. And most of them could never go home again. But they also faced the skepticism of a black community. So I use the phrase in the title to signal that I'm looking at Miss Anne from multiple perspectives. How she saw herself, and that's where the incredible archival research I did for this book really comes in, to allow her to speak in her own voice. What was she trying to do? She did a very unlikely thing, and I bring her back so that she can explain it. But I also look at how the black community saw her, so that we can think about how she's seen from two different perspectives. And it's a reminder that we often still live in divided worlds. So Miss Anne is a phrase. How many of you knew the phrase Miss Anne before I was coming to talk to you? Just Sam. And I use the phrase very deliberately because it's a phrase that everybody in black community knows. It's a very familiar phrase to black community, and most whites don't know it at all. And for me, that's really important to remind myself and my readers that we still live in divided worlds, where something can be very meaningful in one community and be meaningless in another. If that's true in 2013 and 2014, how much truer was it almost 100 years ago when a very unlikely band of white women said, I'm going to go to the Harlem Renaissance. So that's that's a little preamble on the phrase Miss Anne. And that's the image from the cover of my book. You can see Miss Anne there in her green dress, kind of standing out, looking like she's not quite sure what she's about. And Miss Anne came with some really good political intentions, but once she got there, she often found herself out of her league, as it were, a little bit at sea. She often didn't quite know what she was about, or she ended up getting more than she bargained for. And so I found this wonderful image, and that's the cover of the book. And then this next image, nothing. Oh, there we go. I just had to hit it harder. That's Fania Marinoff. Thank you. That's Fania Marinoff in Harlem. When I first set out in search of Miss Anne in Harlem, I found about 6 women who were more than just casual tourists, or as they were called then, slummers. It's a phrase you've heard now, right? You know the phrase slumming. It was derisive then, and it's a derisive term now. I found about 6 women who went beyond just participating in the Harlem Vogue. White women who put Harlem at the center of their lives and who centered their lives on its cultural and political renaissance. These white women were hostesses, editors, activists, philanthropists, patrons, writers, wives, lovers, and mothers. Some of them were wealthy, looking for a place to put their money in the arts. Others lost their money because of their political commitments. Some, there you see, Fannie Hurst. Some like Fannie Hurst, and here she is with her secretary. Can you guys see through me or around me? If not, I'll just invite you to move here so that I don't have to move, if you don't mind. Some, like Fannie Hurst, were Jews. As you probably know, not yet considered white in American culture. Is there anyone here who doesn't know that Jews were not white folks in the 1920s? Everybody knows that? So let me tell you, in the 1920s, Jews, like Northern Italians, were not white folks. The whiteness, like blackness, was a cultural construction, and Jews were not considered white until the mid-1930s and beyond. Now, that doesn't mean they were considered black. They weren't. But they were definitely not considered white. And part of my book is a story of how people used one set of culturally available identities off against another set of culturally available identities. So as I say, some of the, and I put the word in scare quotes, some of the white women who went to Harlem were Jews, not yet considered white in American culture, but suddenly very white indeed. Look how white she looks. She's almost luminescent when they crossed into Harlem. because to black Harlem, they just seemed like white women. So Fannie Hurst very much just seemed like another white woman when she was amongst black people. Jewish dancer Fanny Marinoff from the Bronx, there's Fanny Marinoff, renamed herself. She was born Fanny Marinoff from the Bronx. How many of you are from the Bronx? Anybody? In the Bronx? Your folks are.
Yes.
But she wanted a career in the theater. And she did not think that being Fanny Marinoff from the Bronx was going to do it. So she did what many Jews who were seeking a wider sphere did during this time in American culture. She created a new identity for herself. And the identity she created for herself was Fanya. And she passed as an exotic Russian. And being a Russian was much more exotic at this point in American culture in New York than being a Jew from the Bronx was. And she was able to parlay her new, more exotic identity as Fanya into a stage career. She married the very famous bisexual dandy Carl Van Vechten. Have any of you heard of Carl?
There's a new book out.
New book called The Taste Maker, and a book just before that by Emily Bernard. So there's 2 biographies right now out on Carl Van Vechten. There's a third on the way from Clive Fisher. After she married Carl Van Vechten and reinvented herself as Russian Fanya, she didn't speak any Russian, by the way, she became hostess of the most famous interracial parties in the nation, a gatekeeper, and in her own way, a tastemaker, rather than someone against whom doors could be shut. And she was very convinced that as a lower middle class woman, a Jew, Fanny Marinoff from the Bronx, the doors would be shut against her. And she was equally convinced that she had to reinvent herself to open some of those doors. As Fanya Marinoff, and here she is playing Ariel in The Tempest, she was able to achieve a strong, not a spectacular, but a strong stage career. We could give her a really strong B+. Maybe a B double plus, maybe a B double plus over an A minus, the kind of grade you should never give your own students because it drives them crazy. But she had a strong stage career as Fanya Marinoff. For Fannie Hurst, and you see her there with her little dog, who for most of her life hated being Jewish, almost as much as she hated being dismissed by the critics as a tear-jerking sentimentalist. Has anyone here ever read any Fannie Hurst? Now see, this is important because in her day, Fannie Hurst was the Stephen King of American literature. Not because she wrote mysteries or scary literature, but because she was the biggest selling writer of her day. By far, nobody outsold Fannie Hurst. I'm going to ask you to fess up to an embarrassing fact. How many of you have seen Sex and the City? In reruns? Come on, admit it. I'm admitting it. There's a famous episode in Sex and the City, and it airs as in the previews all the time, where the Sarah Jessica Parker character Carrie sees herself as a billboard on a city bus. That's not Carrie, and that's not Sarah Jessica Parker. In reality, that was Fannie Hurst. Fannie Hurst was the first woman in America to ever be a billboard on a city bus. She was that famous as a writer. But she was also a sentimental writer who wrote mostly about immigrant culture at a moment when realism was not considered the dominant literature of the day. Modernism and avant-garde literature was where you wanted to be. And Fannie Hurst was very desperate to no longer be dismissed by the critics. Harlem, for her, became a pathway, as it did for Fanya Marinoff, to a new identity. She used her time in Harlem to become a serious spokesperson on civil rights and, at last, to become a white woman amongst blacks. She very much wanted to achieve whiteness, and she used her presence in black Harlem, where she seemed white, to achieve a whiteness that she felt was otherwise denied her.
I now understand the context of a comment that came down to me growing up, that I had one grandfather who was very successful in the advertising industry before Jews were really in it. And at some point, somebody called him a white Jew.
There you go. There you go. See, there were whites, Jews, and white Jews. So
which was a terribly derogatory comment.
Unless it was said by whites. If it was said by fellow Jews, it was an insult. If it was said by whites,
I don't know who said
it might have been a compliment.
Yeah.
But this is the trick, right? In understanding the political valence of comments like that, we actually have to know who said them, because it could have actually operated either way. So this is a photograph of one of Fannie Hurst's very best friends. This is Annie Nathan Meyer. Annie Nathan Meyer similarly found that being a white woman in Black Harlem was a way to escape the constraints of both gender and anti-Semitism. That it was a way to stand out and to be noticed. It was a way to honor her upper-class Jewish background, her family's long tradition of Jewish philanthropy and social service, and at the same time to turn her back on those traditions. What I want you to notice in this photograph, I hope you can see it. This is a photograph I found in the Barnard archives. Annie Nathan Meyer is known, if she's known at all today, she's known as the founder of Barnard. How many of you have heard of Annie Nathan Meyer as the founder of Barnard? This is so telling. She would have been sick to know that even at Yeshiva University, she isn't known, because she was the founder of Barnard College, and you all know Barnard. It's, in fact, not that far away. One could walk. Not today, not in this rain, but one could walk. She had a terrible time being recognized as the founder of Barnard College.
Yeah, because they named it after Barnard.
Yes. In fact, she waged what she called a lifelong struggle for the definite article. She was sometimes acknowledged as a founder of Barnard, indefinite article, one of the founders of Barnard. She wanted the definite article, and she earned it. She was the founder of Barnard. She and her husband took out the mortgage on the building. That was the first college. It was all her doing. She went door to door to get the money. And she always attributed the failure to get her failure to get that definite article, the founder, to anti-Semitism. If you go to Barnard today, there's still almost no recognition of her. There's an unidentified portrait of her hanging, but it's very hard for her, even today.
Where's it hanging?
It's hanging in the student lounge. So you can still see it there. Did you go to, were you at Columbia and Martin? We'll come back to that. Anyway.
He was admitted to Barnard, but he chose
her archives are, half of her archives are in Cincinnati at the AJS. Half of her archives are at Barnard. The archives at Barnard are uncatalogued. It's just a bunch of boxes, stuff all jumbled together. Yeah, this is the founder of Barnard. They're unindexed, they're uncatalogued. Now, that could have changed. I first started working on this book about 9 years ago. When I first started working on her papers, they were completely unindexed. Buried in a box, carefully matted, I found this photograph of her. It was with other materials of her. I'm pretty convinced, although I can't prove it, that she's the one that's pasted these letters from newspaper onto her own studio photograph. And I want you to notice what they say. Listen. Okay, so first of all, here's a picture of her, right? Classic picture of a 16 or 17-year-old woman from the day, right? Even not looking into the camera was all part of what an upper-class woman sort of showed her proper femininity and her move into the future. But look at what she's pasted onto the bottom of it. Listen, honestly, get out. Such an interesting photograph. It's one of my favorites. Let me tell you a little bit about Annie Nathan Meyer to give you a sense of how the book moves between social and political issues of identity in a historical context and biography. The book tells the full biographies of 6 women, most of them quite little known, including Annie Nathan Meyer. So just a little brief piece about Annie Nathan Meyer. She was born on February 19th, 1867, into a relatively opulent but also a circumscribed world at odds with her own ambitions. The Nathan's world was a tight-knit Jewish version of Edith Wharton's Old New York. A private clubbed, grand pianoed, silver-serviced world of Sephardim from the South, Manhattan, and Rittenhouse Square. It was narrow, provincial, smug, self-satisfied, her sister, the prominent suffragist Maud Nathan, put it. This was a world of libraries and music rooms downstairs and made-to-order furniture and drawing rooms upstairs. The household staff included Irish maids, a waitress, 2 nurses, a governess, 3 servants, and a yard man. Seamstresses were brought into the house to hand-make the family's clothing, their mattress covers, their sheets, their pillowcases, and their bath linens. Unlike some households, which reserve their best things for company, quote, "We used our solid silver every day," Meyer remembered. The Nathans were one of New York's first families, and their genealogy included presidents of stock exchanges, renowned rabbis, Columbia University trustees, Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo, I don't have to tell you folks who that was, and Emma Lazarus, whose poem The New Colossus was engraved on the tablet within the pedestal on which the Statue of Liberty stands. The Nathans were, quote, imbued with the spirit of New York's social directory. Annie Nathan Meyer was raised with the understanding that her family was, quote, the nobility of Jewry and the nearest approach to royalty in the United States. Nathan men were expected to accomplish great things, but Nathan women were expected to hang back. And part of the meaning of this photograph, including the fact that she gazes off into the middle distance and not directly at you, is all tied up with notions of womanhood in her day. Women were expected to hang back, not to push themselves forward. Her mother, Southern-born Augusta Ann Florence, who had grown up well-to-do and surrounded by slaves, had very decided views about her 2 daughters, Annie and Maud. The girls were told to have no pursuits of their own. They were sent to dancing school, and they were taught to cook and to sew and to embroider. Despite all their privileges, Annie and her sister grew up, she later wrote, quote, heart-hungry, brain famished. Heart-hungry, brain famished. Listen, honestly, get out. Annie was a brilliant child, but her father discouraged her studies. Quote, men hate intelligent wives, he warned her, just before he abandoned the family altogether. Annie was a born contrarian, and she chafed against the gender standards of her day. Listen, honestly, get out. She also was someone who craved attention. She always wanted to stand out. That was very important to her. She and her sister Maud became known as the Fighting Nathan Sisters. When Maud became a social activist and a suffragist, Meyer, her sister, became staunchly, even infamously, anti-suffrage. She did it mostly despite Maud, one family member maintained. In her autobiography, Meyer wrote proudly of how her many indignant essays, quote, attracted a great deal of attention from all over the country. And she was sort of the queen of the op-ed. She literally wrote thousands of short essays on every political current event of the day you could possibly imagine. And all over the place, in newspapers all over the nation, but many of them in the New York Times. It would make a wonderful collected book, but except nobody's heard of Annie Nathan Meyer, so what would we do with it? And she loved the way her essays, quote, kept her in the public eye as the most forceful of the antis as well as of other things. Being taken seriously for her meant moving into realms that were not already inundated with women such as herself. She wanted to stand out. She didn't want to blend in. So for Annie Nathan Meyer, this ruled out suffrage, because that was Maud's domain. Suffrage was her sister's domain, and it also ruled out settlement work. because she didn't want to blend into the other small sea of upper-class women, many of them Jewish, who were doing settlement work. So she had to find some other arena where she could get out, but also stand out. And what she did is she went to Black Harlem and became a, quote, Negro dramatist. This is the play for which she became very famous. The play was called Black Souls. It was finally staged by the Provincetown Playhouse in 1932, but she wrote it in 1924. In 1924, when she began writing the play that made her a, quote, Negro dramatist, and she was known as a Negro dramatist throughout Black Harlem, she was already the author of 8 successful plays, numerous novels, many essays, and hundreds of editorials of what would eventually, as I said earlier, become thousands of editorials, none of them collected to my knowledge anywhere at all. Not entirely successful, however, with that vast corpus of writing, which many people would have considered more than enough, particularly for a woman of her background, she began drafting this play, Black Souls, which she considered her most daring and her most important work. She wrote this during a time when many successful, quote, Negro plays were, in fact, white-authored. This was a period where it was possible to be a white writer and be considered a Negro dramatist. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. But Annie Nathan Meyer disdained the work of other white writers. She called their work not authentic, and she set out to do something that she could consider much bigger. Am I doing okay on time so far?
Yeah, it's about 20 of if you want to move along in terms of your different personalities. It's up to you.
So we'll just get as far as I get, and then people will have to buy the book at a certain point, which is really good, for me. So the play Black Souls was set on, I'm not going to try to get through all 6 personalities, so not to worry. The play Black Souls was set on the campus of a Southern black college founded by whites. In an era when female desire was virtually unspeakable, let alone female desire of white women for black men, what this play Black Souls did is it told a story of a young white woman in love with a black man. Meyer wrote, "To me, the most original note in my play had been the hitherto untouched accusation that beneath the lynching of the Negro, beneath the Southern white man's determination at all costs to protect his women, was the dread that some of the white women, responded to the call of the strong black man. When Luella, that's her white woman character, when Luella throws herself into the arms of her black lover one night in the dark woods, and the play is very melodramatic, she and Fannie Hurst very much shared a writing style. When Luella throws herself into David's arms, they are overseen by local whites, and you know what's coming now, right? David is lynched, right? You knew that was coming. The plot made even Zora Neale Hurston nervous. But Josephine Cogdell Schuyler, another of the 6 women I write about in my book, Josephine Cogdell Schuyler insisted Josephine Cogdell Schuyler was born into a Texas family. She was the daughter of the town banker. Her family, the Cogdells, were the wealthiest family in town. Her father, D.C. Cogdell, who founded the bank, also was the founder and charter member of the local chapter of the Klan. All her brothers were charter members of the Klan.
What was the town?
Granbury, Texas. Have you been there?
No.
They brought me. It was really unnerving, I have to tell you. I thought, uh-oh, what do I do, right? I did go to Granbury, Texas in February, and I have to say, modern Granbury is a lovelier place. They were very nice to me, and I didn't get boiled in a big pot, which was, of course, my fear. Josephine Cogdell Schuyler married George Schuyler, the most well-known, influential black journalist in the nation in his day. And as the wife of George Schuyler, she also passed for 6 other people. If we have enough time, I may talk about some of them later or in the question and answer period. But she also wrote about what other white women were doing. and she was very interested in Annie Nathan Meyer's play. And this is what she said about it. Zora Neale Hurston said to Annie Nathan Meyer, she collaborated with Meyer on the play, and she said, "Oh, don't tell this story. It's too much for the American stage. People won't believe it." This is what Josephine Cogdell Schuyler said. She said, "The play is, quote, absolutely true to life. To have a Southern girl of the upper classes who has seen her father keep black mistresses fall in love with a Negro is not nearly so unusual as people like to think. In fact, I did exactly that myself, and for this reason, your play rings exceedingly true." But this play was considered unstageable for 8 years. You may notice that one of the little pieces on the play is written by Josephine's husband, George Schuyler. When the Provincetown Playhouse finally decided to mount it in 1932, they did so in direct response to the ongoing Scottsboro trials. Does everyone know about the Scottsboro case? So in 1932, when Provincetown mounted the play, they were 3 months into the period which followed Ruby Bates's recantation. So the Scottsboro case, to put it really quickly in case anybody doesn't know but doesn't want to say they don't know, 8 young black men accused of raping 2 white women on a train in Alabama. Eventually one of the 2 women, and they're tried over and over and over again. There's no evidence for this rape. They're tried over and over and over again. They're found guilty. They're sentenced to death. Trial after trial keeps moving through the court systems. Finally, one of the women, Ruby Bates, recants. She says, "Never happened. Never happened." In fact, one of the reasons they're pushed into this, it turns out that the 2 women were riding the rails in men's clothing. They were passing as male laborers. And passing was so volatile, so controversial in American culture at this time, even though, as my book shows, it was widely practiced for many reasons by many different people in many different ways. The sheriff encouraged these 2 women, both of whom had prostitution backgrounds, by the way, to claim that they had been raped. So Ruby Bates recants. She says the whole thing never happened, and the progressives in the country who'd been following the trial think, good, well, now it's going to be over. The 8 boys are going to be released, right? She says it never happened. Makes no difference at all. She says it never happened, and they continue to be found guilty over and over and over again. And for much of the nation, it becomes a lesson in the workings of racism, that it has a life of its own, and that once that train has left this station, it sort of takes on its own life. So the play was finally able to be staged in 1932, I think because of Scottsboro, but it was closed as too scandalous for the American stage and only 10 performances. Josephine Cogdell Schuyler, along with much of Harlem, was irate. Black Souls, she said, is accusing them on their own ground, and they can't tolerate it. Here's Annie Nathan Meyer as she looked during her life in Harlem, as she looked during her time in Black Harlem. She became good friends with Fannie Hurst, and that was a rare instance of white women bonding together during this political movement. The white women I found who went into Black Harlem, many of them, like Annie Nathan Meyer, went there because they could use race against gender. Let me explain what I mean. Almost without exception, these were white women who looked at the gender script of their day. They looked at what women were supposed to do and they said, ooh, this isn't enough. This is too constraining, this is too confining, I need a bigger life. And they looked around themselves at how am I going to carve a bigger life for myself. They looked at Greenwich Village and they said, maybe. And they looked at the Left Bank in Paris and they said, maybe. And a few very canny white women looked at Black Harlem and they realized if they went into Black Harlem as white women, they would absolutely stand out, and it would be a way using race, being involved in race, to carve out a much larger sphere for themselves than they would ever be able to do anywhere else, because in Black Harlem, who's going to tell them what to do? Who's going to tell this woman what to do in Black Harlem, right? Nobody. So this is not to say that's the only reason they go, but it's a story. My book is a story about how different vectors of cultural and social identity can be used in relationship to each other and against one another. Because these white women often wanted to stand out, they often wanted to elbow more freedom for themselves than was otherwise available, they tended to avoid one another. They did not form a movement. They didn't bond with one another. Remember, these are women who wanted to stand out. So if they all hung out together and they sat together at the benefits and the events, then they wouldn't stand out as a lone white woman in Harlem. One of the only instances we have of white female friendship in this period in Black Harlem is Annie Nathan-Meyer and Fannie Hurst. Nancy?
Is there a tension between them trying to escape these oppressive external social constructs and wanting to use racial power against black people?
No. I would not go that far. I wouldn't say they wanted to use racial power against black people.
Okay.
So I'm glad you asked that. It's not that strong. I wouldn't put it that strongly. When I say that you can use one form of identity against another, I don't mean against in the strong sense of to put oneself in opposition to. I mean that they were creating a dynamic where they played off against one another. Were there tensions? That's what the story of this book is. This is a book that tells the story of the way in which these different agendas, as we would now say, come into tension with one another. Just in deference to Professor Gellens, let me just get through talking about very, very briefly a couple of the other women, and then I think it'll probably be time for us to stop for questions. But let me introduce you to a couple of the other figures in the book. One of them, and maybe the only one you may have heard of prior to today, is Nancy Cunard. How many of you have heard of Nancy Cunard? Cunard Line cruise ships. Have you heard of that? Okay. So now you know that was Nancy Cunard. She was the only daughter of the Cunard family. She was heir to one of the biggest fortunes in Britain. Now they're known for cruise ships. In their day, they were known for the shipping industry. And if you know your 19th century history, you know where the big money was. The big money was in shipping, and it was in railroads. They were one of the biggest shipping lines in the world. Nancy Cunard once said that she, quote, longed for a white friend with feelings such as mine. But for the most part, as I was saying to you, Miss Anne was a loner. She often embraced isolation as part of the cost of what she was trying to do. Some of the white women who went seriously to Harlem, as you see here, were matronly and mature, and others were classic, even iconic, new women and flappers. All of them believed to varying degrees that they could and should embrace blackness, take responsibility for whiteness, even if they were not considered white by the rest of the culture, and that's part of the story, and try to be something other than what they were born. When I started working on this book, no one had ever put them together as a group before. No one had ever looked at them seriously. No one had ever asked them to explain why they crossed social lines, which were then seen as impenetrable, what they were seeking, or what their experience of experimenting with identity was like for them. But in their day, they were asked that question all the time. Trinidadian poet Alfred Cruikshank, for example, wrote a published poem asking why Nancy Cunard, and there she is holding her famous anthology, Negro, she gave up that entire fortune to become an activist involved with black civil rights. She lost all of that money. The vast Cunard fortune, she was the only heir, she was the only child. She took a black lover. He was a jazz musician from Alabama named Henry Crowder. Saxophonist, by the way. I know you're a trumpeter, right? He was a saxophonist. And you recognize the name? Almost nobody else would. When she refused to renounce or hide Henry Crowder, she was completely disinherited. She became involved in Black Harlem. She was written up in the British press in very, very ugly ways for her involvement in Black Harlem, and the European press has a different, to this day, has a different set of libel laws than we do. She was able to sue for libel and defamation. She took all the money she got in her lawsuit. She poured it into the largest anthology of interracial literature ever published. This remains true to this day. It's 880 pages. If you can find a copy now, it sells for between $18,000 and $25,000. If you own one, let me know. All right, I'm happy to talk cash. You know, there are almost no copies left. She poured all the money into this anthology and left herself completely destitute for the rest of her life. She died at 67 pounds, a raving alcoholic on the street, in part because she gave up her own fortune. She was known for the price she paid for her politics, as were almost all the Miss Annes in Harlem. So that's an important piece to understand. They came with mixed motives. They needed things for themselves, but they paid a very high cost for what they did. and they were highly regarded for the cost they were willing to pay. Trinidadian poet Cruikshank asked her why it was she did that. "What was it, madame," he wrote in his poem, "made you to enlist in our sad cause your all of heart and soul?" Nancy Cunard had no interest in privacy. She would have loved the modern Twitter world where there is no privacy, so she answered him in a published poem. She answered him in public. She said, this is her answer, and it reveals to you some of the complicated ideas white women brought into black culture. She said, "Maybe I was an African one time." And later she simply declared, "I am African. I am black. I am Africa." She believed that identity was not blood, was not biology, but identity was allegiance, desire, and affiliation. And by giving up her fortune and declaring herself black, she could be black, that this could be a symbolic act that would counter racism. And one way or another, almost all the white women I write about in this book did exactly the same thing. They didn't just say, "I want to be part of the Harlem Renaissance." They actually volunteered for blackness. This is at an unthinkable moment in American culture. The 1920s, as you may know, are one of the most racist times in American history. And this is a book about white women who volunteered for blackness very deliberately and usually at high cost. Often, in fact, throughout Black Harlem, by their black friends, they were asked what they were doing and why they did it. Mary White Ovington. Anybody know Mary White Ovington? How many of you know that the NAACP has a white founder? Mary White Ovington, born in Brooklyn Heights, white founder of the NAACP. "I have found," she wrote, "since I have become known in radical Negro work, that colored people, under their pleasant greetings, are often thinking, 'Why did you take up the Negro cause?' I try to answer," Mary White Ovington wrote, "but it takes a long time to explain." And taking the time to explain is what the rest of my book does, but I hope I've given you a little bit of a taste of it in my allotted half hour, and I am now delighted to take your questions. Thanks for listening.
You mentioned the Scottsboro Boys made me think of, first of all, their defense was financed largely by the Communist Party.
Yes.
Were any of the Miss Ann's communists?
So not only was the defense of the Scottsboro Boys financed in large part by the Communist Party. I'm so glad you asked me that. It's almost as if you're my straight man and this is a setup. This is a perfect question for me.
I'm not Chico.
But this is really helpful. One of the reasons the Communist Party ends up financing the defense of the Scottsboro Boys, and one of the things I uncover in this book, is that some of that story of the Communist Party financing that defense is a story of the conflict of personalities and a story of what I would call the sororophobic nature of white women or Miss Anne in Harlem. Part of what unfolds during this period, as I mentioned earlier, you have two groups of white women coming into Black Harlem for a variety of reasons. An older generation, typified by women like Annie Nathan Meyer, and a younger generation of women typified by women like Nancy Cunard. And the Nancy Cunards, they were flappers, they were new women, they were looking for sexual liberation, they were looking for a kind of, different cultural experience. The women like Mary White Ovington had a very different relationship to the notion of publicity. They felt that the only way they could do anything that was valuable in Black Harlem is to draw no attention to themselves. They felt that white women had played such an ignoble role in the history of American racial relations that they had to be careful not to take center stage. So, it's really not your fault you haven't heard of Mary White Ovington. She sort of did that to herself. Mary White Ovington was especially appalled by Nancy Cunard. Nancy Cunard was one of the lead fundraisers for the Scottsboro Boys Defense Fund in Great Britain. And in Great Britain, that was a socialist defense fund, not just a communist defense fund. But because Mary White Ovington was so appalled by Nancy Cunard, and because much of the NAACP was not convinced that this was the right case to use to advance black civil rights because it smacked of sexual relations, the NAACP was dragging its feet. And one of the reasons for the foot dragging was the personal relationship, the personal tension, to go back to your question, between Ovington and Cunard. Into that vacuum jumps the Communist Party, which is what they were doing throughout Harlem in this period. They were seizing vacuums, and they said, okay, we'll take up this defense fund. The NAACP very much ended up ruining their wariness. They were not happy with the defense of the case. But there was a lot of question of whether, on the one hand, it was a cause célèbre throughout America, because what the ineffective nature of Ruby Bates's recantation showed the rest of the country the way in which what Nancy Cunard called the lynch machinery worked. That it didn't even matter what did or didn't happen. Facts were irrelevant, right? Lynching was not about who did what to who. It was part of a system of national terrorism. And so on the one hand, the case was very important throughout the country. On the other hand, the black civil rights organizations felt it might be too hot to handle. So this is one of the reasons, and part of my book tells the personal backstory behind that struggle between the NAACP and the Communist Party over who's going to handle the case. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope so.
But it makes me think of white people in the 20s, for example, Lincoln Steffens, who went to the Soviet Union and said, I've seen the future and it works.
Yeah.
The great black actor and singer, Paul Robeson, was of the same mentality.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if and he spent time in Harlem.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if various of these Miss Anns had the same attitude as the white Lincoln Steffens regarding the new Soviet Union.
So, okay, that's a great question. So, there's a lot of good work that has been done on the history of the Communist Party in Harlem in the 1920s and the 1930s. Some of you may know Nason's book, Communists in Harlem. Great history of the Communist Party in Harlem. There were a number of very important black figures in Harlem who were members of the Communist Party. Robeson, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, who were either declared communists or socialists. But the Communist Party was also considered to be very exploitive by most of the Harlem intelligentsia, including some of these figures themselves, who were very critical of the way in which the Communist Party came in with white leadership and a white agenda, and instead of listening to black radicals about what they wanted, said sort of, here's the program. So some of what was being said when some Harlem intelligentsia, black Harlem intelligentsia said, we like what we see in the Soviet Union, they were actually telling the Communist Party at home, we're better listened to there than we are here. The Russians are listening more to us than here. So there was a lot of conflict over the role of the Communist Party in Harlem. There was a great support for communism, right, as an ideology, and this was true throughout, as I think you know, the 1930s. This is the story of the sort of cultural left in America. And this goes to some of the other issues I was raising, even about the difference between aesthetic styles, who values the avant-garde, who values realism. These debates divide along political lines. But the Communist Party is, for the most part, considered to be disrespectful in Harlem, considered to have, not taken leadership from the ground up. So that's part of this whole story. Some of the women I write about, particularly Josephine Cogdell Schuyler, were socialists. Some, like Nancy Cunard, considered themselves communists. There is a whole story of white communist women who came into Black Harlem to do organizing. For reasons I probably don't have to explain, there are almost no records of their work that are available, even in places like the Tamament Library at NYPL, and that story to this day remains untold. So I would have loved to have told that part of the story, because there were white communist women who came in as designated organizers in Black Harlem. There's almost no archival record of what they did. We know they were there, they're discussed, but they didn't leave an archive. So that piece that you're asking about is another book somebody's going to have to write when somebody turns over those boxes. But I couldn't find them.
What would the records be in
Why?
the Soviet Union and the Comintern's records. Because
Possible.
Because the Communist Party here, in many ways, did the bidding of the Comintern. Nationality questions, race questions.
Possible. It is not impossible, because one of the things you know if you do archival work is stuff ends up in really weird places.
Oh, yeah.
And it is not impossible that somebody could go to the Soviet Union, do work in the Comintern archives, and find the never before discussed autobiographies of 3 white women who went to Harlem to organize. They could be there. I didn't follow the trail in that direction. For one thing, I speak no Russian, so I would have been pretty useless to myself. And for another thing, after about 50 archives here, I have to admit I sort of ran out of gas. But I do think that story remains to be told.
It's a question.
Yeah.
One very small point. To the best of my knowledge, Paul Robeson never was actually a card carrying.
This is why I went like this when I said it.
His son was, and his son says my father was never.
And you know his son just died. Did everyone see?
Yeah,
I'm sorry to say the obit. Paul Robeson Jr. just died.
The other point in terms of your comment, I think conceptually what can make a difference is kinds of alliance for communism. So I think Steffens and many other intellectuals and journalists who said, I've seen the future and it works. And some of these are people who said exactly the same thing with Mussolini.
Well,
You know,
before,
they were
before-
focused on the
before
future.
Stalin became general
There's
secretary.
a different attitude when you have somebody saying, in effect, I've seen the present, and I prefer communism to that. And I suspect that many of the people we're speaking about now may not have been interested in futurism as much as the sense that you have an intolerable situation, and if the communists are the people who are on the right side on this, then we'll travel along.
So yes, and I won't. This whole question of whether Robeson was or wasn't, it is indeed controversial, which is why I made that sort of gesture when I referred to him as a communist. Like, well, you know, and I do want to respect his son's insistence that not other people say yes, including just to fill out the story, his own wife Islanda says yes, we were, and there's a wonderful new biography of Islanda out by Barbara Ramsey that just came out last year. So, I mean, it is a controversial question. This notion you're pointing to, which is the larger question you're raising, is something that has used to be very current in histories of this period. This notion that Black Americans supported communism and or socialism largely because, and largely only because, they saw communist and or socialist countries and or communists and socialists as people who were more progressive on the race question. It is much more common now to say, yeah, that's not really the whole story. These are also intellectuals who had a highly developed understanding of what we now call the intersexual relationship between race and class, and who in fact, as anti-essentialists on race, were advancing a class analysis of oppression that is really what led them to communism and socialism as much as race. So even your question points to the ways in which, as we uncover more and more material to tell the stories of this period, we have to keep deepening our understanding of what we now call intersectionality, the relationship between different social categories of difference, gender, race, class, sexuality, and so on. Part of my challenge in this book was to see how I could do that through biography, to see how I could deepen different notions of intersectionality by actually bringing back to life 6 people who had never had a chance to tell their own story. So the sort of intersectionality was part of the methodological challenge of this project. I think, wait, before I come back to, did I have another question over? Yeah. Let me go to people who didn't ask one and then circle back around, if that's okay. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a comment, I guess, and that is, I think it's really worth remembering that in the 20s and 30s, there really wasn't much of a stigma in a place like New York about socialism or communism.
Exactly.
They were very much in the ascendant and very well respected and so on.
Yeah.
And so someone has yet to write the story of communism and socialism through the decades, including the pseudo-Obama chapter, and now there's going to be the Piketty chapter.
Yeah.
But it really just sort of keeps going up and down in different ways all the time. But I think people retroject back the picture of the 50s and somehow before the Cold War ended back into it, and it just absolutely was not there.
And this is a very important piece of what I was referring to earlier about an understanding of the cultural front during this period, is that lots of people are declaring themselves communist in a period in a way that later becomes sort of unthinkable in America.
Without necessarily signing up or signing a piece of paper,
without necessarily being card carrying.
I think Langston Hughes had a story like
I'll
that.
have to tell some of that story with the book I'm writing now. I'm not going to tell that history, that's not my project, but the book I'm writing now is a biography of Jessica Mitford. And for those of you who know who Jessica Mitford was, part of the story of trying to explain Jessica Mitford's civil rights work, her progressive work, and finally her muckraking, and this goes back to Lincoln Steffens. I'm so glad people brought Steffens. She was one of the great muckrakers, and Steffens, as you know, is the sort of originator of the form as we know it. One of the controversial issues in Jessica Mitford's background is why she was so late to leave the party, and why even after the party became completely stigmatized, she was very late to actually, she was card carrying. She was very late to turn in her card. So I'll have to do a little tiny piece of that history, but I'm not going to write the whole book. If you find the whole book, please let me know, because then I can use it. Yeah, I saw some other questions. Yeah.
I was going to add, when you were speaking earlier about resentment of white presence and particularly communist presence in Harlem, but also that Richard Wright comes to write, Drop the Tail. His vision in Native Son is very much, the whole book really opens with a sense of that. It's an exploited relationship, and then goes on to really build a book which is fascinated with abuses of the white construction of black race, and really creates the first black character who he hopes will be incomprehensible to its white readers. And I think sexuality is so central to that it really comes back to a lot of these questions about the death of these kind of veterans.
Also, I would just add, I love that comment, and I would just add to it that one of the reasons white women are able to come into Black Harlem and volunteer for blackness and sign up as honorary or voluntary Negroes at this particular moment, because the book really focuses on 1927 to 1935, is that when you have other organizations like the Communist Party very much moving into black culture, it creates a space in which this is a recognizable thing to do. They do it differently. So people are, again, using sort of one available modality in a different way.
Sort of ride that.
You ride that.
Back to the point Josh was making earlier. To sort of ride that inequity into a space where a different inequity
Exactly.
is
To use
possible
precisely.
without necessarily being exploited, or maybe that potential is there.
Well,
yeah, I guess it is. I guess the issue really here has to do with trading one inequity for another, and of course no one could volunteer for whiteness.
So, well, first of all, no one could volunteer for whiteness. Part of what this whole history shows is that blackness and whiteness are asymmetrical. They are both social constructions, but they are cultural constructions that work asymmetrically, and passing in one direction is not identical to passing in another. But part of my argument in this book is that the question we're so prone to ask today, is it exploitative? Were they appropriating? That's the wrong question. Because as soon as you've asked that question, you misunderstand what's going on at this historical moment. Because the most surprising thing I found in my historical research was precisely the ways in which, and the extent to which, Black Harlem welcomes a set of white gestures we would now dismiss as exploitive and appropriative. And rather than dismiss those out of hand as exploitation, Black Harlem in to a degree really a lot of historians have not talked about sufficiently, says, yeah, let's get a bunch of whites signing up for volunteering for blackness. I think this is a good idea. In fact, one of the things I discovered in the course of doing the research for this book is that the two lead black journals of the day, and I'm sure you've all heard of them, Crisis and Opportunity, variably the two journals of the NAACP and the Urban League, they each had a poet's page. That's not the surprising thing. Everybody had a poet's page. All the newspapers had a poet's page. You can't imagine this now, right? You open the Times, page 4 is a poet's page. I don't think so. But in the day, everybody had a poet's page or a poet's corner. Late 1920s, the two black papers start taking that poet's corner and they start turning it into a forum for white views on blackness. This is the extent to which whites are encouraged, and many of these are poems written in black voices by whites.
I mean, I think ultimately when Wright published the Native Sonnets, of course, by then it's 1940, and I think he's looking back and saying, from his point of view, that was a fiction, that it could happen that way. And in fact, he openly says in his essay How Bigger Was Born, he's trying to create a character that not even bankers' daughters could cry over.
Right.
He's not going to make a space for that emotional connection.
Well, and of course, the most troubled Miss Anne I can think of, speaking of bankers' daughters, is Mary Dalton from that book. Mary Dalton is Bigger's critique of the possibility of a kind of white earnestness about race. Because remember that Mary Dalton's signature characteristic is her earnestness, right? She wants to understand Bigger. She wants to get it right. And it's her earnestness that actually kills her. It's her, because what she doesn't understand is that race is an institution and that individuals' attitudes, earnest or otherwise, in Wright's view, because Wright has an institutional understanding of race, doesn't amount to a hill of beans, right? She doesn't understand that race is an institution. She thinks by being well-intentioned. Do you remember how well-intentioned she is in the car when they're in the car with Bigger, right? And she keeps sort of trying to make friends with him, and the more she does, the more she endangers him. And Wright is pointing to an institutional history of white women whose very presence in a room, whose very looking at a black man could cost that person their lives historically. And Wright says you have to have an institutional answer to institutional racism. Earnestness won't do it. But this was a debate throughout Black Harlem in the 1920s and 30s, whether earnest whites could make a meaningful contribution. That's exactly the debate that's going on, that these white women walk into by saying, yeah, sign us up, right? And what's interesting is not only do they say sign us up, many of them have a pretty sophisticated understanding of institutional racism. So they're complicating things in a lot of different directions. Did we get to everybody the first time around? Yeah, go ahead.
On the question of exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
when Gershwin produces Porgy and Bess,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly, there was resentment about his horning in or exploiting black themes. Is there a difference between sort of before and what I'm alluding to?
So is there a difference
Is
between...
there a difference between what you were discussing and what I'm alluding to now? Is it a question of commercialism or...
So I would say there's a huge difference. I'm not sure the difference is one of genre or one of even historical moment as much as it is one of content and collaboration. So Annie Nathan Meyer, who is lauded throughout Black Harlem as a Negro dramatist, this is one of the highest compliments black folks can pay white folks, right? You are an honorary Negro, right? We're going to give you that appellation. She collaborated with James Weldon Johnson and Zora Neale Hurston on the writing of that play. And she was very deliberate in trying to move her black characters away from what blacks saw as stereotypes. So the way in which she did that was she studied black literature and she studied black stereotypes and she studied the writings of blacks who talked about what were black stereotypes. And she was considered to have achieved that in the play. Whether Gershwin did or didn't attempt to do that. These are characters that are white views of blacks, not black views of blacks. And I think that's really the difference. So this notion, this goes back to your question, is to what extent whites can either adopt or approximate a black view of blackness rather than reproduce a white view of blackness. My favorite moment in the Sterling tapes, and I have not yet had a chance to listen to the entire thing, I'm with you guys instead, although I'm dying to get all the way through the whole audio tape. Have you guys been following the Sterling controversy? The former Clippers owner?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? My favorite moment in this whole controversy is when Sterling is instructing his girlfriend, who is a woman of color, in how to seem more white. And she counters him and says, I'm Chicana and black. And he says, no, you're delicate. Right? Right? Did you catch that? Which is code. Right? So he's imposing on her, right, these white notions of blackness and whiteness, and she's attempting to counter. It's just an amazing moment in this controversy. In a way, I have to say, I almost regret that the sanction and his ouster has happened so quickly. You know, he's banned for life from the NBA. He cannot even go to a game, right? Can't show his face. Literally. I don't know how you do this legally, but he's got can't show your face, like, ruling, and a $2.5 million fine and maybe more to come. And I almost regret that it came down so quickly, because I'm afraid the debate won't go on for longer. And this debate is important because people treat Sterling and his notions of whiteness and blackness as if they're outlier notions. They're not. This is actually really mainstream stuff. And it's been mainstream since the 1920s. So
we had, when was it, 2 weeks ago, with this rancher from Montana,
Bundy.
this scandal.
Bundy. This guy, you know, slaves were better off. They could pick cotton. And then when he's challenged, he said, I'm just asking, right? Aren't I allowed to ask, right? First Amendment rights, right? Now, I mean, again, it's sort of unfortunate because now everybody has to disown him really, really quickly, right? But I mean, I think this is really important to remember. You know, sometimes we look back at the 20s and we like to sort of pat ourselves on how far we've moved beyond this, and we understand where the line between a progressive racial statement and an exploitation is.
Sounds like Justice Roberts.
Yeah, but do we? I mean, really, you know, we've got a world full of Bundys, and we've got a world full of Sterlings. Yeah.
You mentioned how there are, like, sort of an asymmetrical criteria for how a white person succeeds as being white and black person black, and how, you know, in interactions people might be carrying their own, you know, definitions for their groups and cultures, and how that can sort of not lead to success because of, like, the larger, like, institutional issues. I wonder if communism sort of found a way to mediate those, you know, two areas, or are they just coming in a different way? And even if larger question of just, should there be a middle space, or is the goal to sort of just occupy the territory of the other and understand it?
Ooh, that's such a complicated set of questions. So to the middle part of your question, whether communism provided a solution to that, this is a big debate in critical race studies, in history. I will just say I am not one of the people who think it did offer a solution. In fact, I think the American Communist movement at this moment in American history fundamentally didn't get it. Didn't really understand that the way in which the asymmetries of race operated at this moment in American culture is that whiteness was a property which could be achieved, sometimes achieved through other vectors such as enough class advancement. You get enough money in American culture at this moment, you become white no matter what you look like. Whiteness can be bought, but blackness is understood not as a property which can be achieved, earned, acquired. Blackness is understood throughout American culture at this moment in history as a biological contaminant. And the reason it intersects in such complicated ways with gender, which is some of what my book tries to unpack, is because that notion of contaminant, once it gets tied to notions of drops of blood, becomes very, very easily sexualized, so that part of the asymmetry is that exposure to blackness works very differently for white men than it does for white women. And these are things the Communist Party didn't understand at all. Because the Communist Party, in an effort to move interracialism forward, advances a position of support for intermarriage that doesn't understand this, that doesn't really have a deep understanding of the way in which blackness is understood as a sexualized contaminant at this moment in American culture. But the reason this is so amazing to me, if I can just belabor the Sterling point for a minute, is if you've been listening at all to his argument to his girlfriend, who remember is a woman of color, what he's saying to her about, I wish you wouldn't go out in public with black men, is you will be contaminated. Your constructed whiteness, which I purchase with my money. So he still carries this notion, right, which again the Communist Party didn't quite get, that blackness operates as contaminant. And this is what he's saying to his girlfriend. What's her name? I forgot her name. Navi. Anyway, whatever. He's saying to her, you will be contaminated. That and actually, it's interesting because he's right? Whiteness is highly unstable. Part of the asymmetry is blackness is completely stable. Once you've got it, you can't get rid of it. If you have one drop of black blood, you have one drop of black blood forever. There's nothing you can do to get rid of it. You can't pass. You can't leave it behind. You can't change. Fundamental to an American racist understanding of race, right? But whiteness is unstable. You can earn your way into it, but you have to be really careful because it's really precious. And if you contaminate yourself, you can lose it. Particularly unstable for women. And that's part of the story I'm telling in this book. The way in which a group of white women, at a moment when whiteness was not only unstable but tied to cultural notions of gender, risk both. Risk their own whiteness and in so doing risk their womanhood and why they do it. Yeah.
Beyond the point of gender that you are analyzing, which I perfectly get, but are there parallels? I mean, I am very ignorant of popular culture, but with these white rappers that somehow they are perceived that they are crossing the barrier and they are becoming part of the black. Is there some similarity with these women that intellectually in the 20s they decided to be part of a black cultural movement?
It's such a great question, and I'm just going to touch a piece of it, which is to say that, and I do talk about Wigger culture at the very end of my book, to make a case that we are actually looking at a 100-year cultural continuum in which the white fascination with blackness actually resonates from the 19-teens to today.
Eminem, I forget the name.
Eminem, in which Eminem's fascination is not much different than we see in the 19-teens and 20s in white culture, in the droves of white people who are flocking to Harlem throughout the 1920s, and the debate over whether Eminem can, whether he is allowed to, whether he has the right to do that kind of music is precisely the debate we see operating in the 1920s over whether or not whites can achieve the status of either voluntary or honorary Negroes. And so if you follow the white women I write about straight through to Eminem, you can see there's a connected debate, which is a debate about what constitutes authentic identity. What are the grounds in which or on which that authenticity is established? We live in a moment in which most of us, I think, would say, oh no, I'm not an essentialist. I understand that there's no such thing as identity that's purely biological or in the blood, but in fact, it's cultural. I see it as cultural, most people would now say. But in fact, when pushed, for example, to say what's wrong with Eminem, what most people end up advancing as an argument about why Eminem is exploitive is a notion of authenticity which does have some biological and not just cultural base. So part of my argument in this book is that in the same way we see a lot of tension between anti-essentialists and social constructionists, many of whom are exactly the same person arguing both things at the same moment. Most of the people in the 20s are talking both things out of both sides of their mouth at the same moment. In fact, most of us are still doing the same today, and the Eminem debate is a way of pointing it out. Yeah.
Well, along lines of similar questions earlier, I'm just sort of thinking through, to some extent, the black-white essentialism or blurring, or however you want to put it, asymmetry, with gender. And I've forgotten, is it Herskovitz? Is that the anthropologist who edited the original?
Melville, do you mean Melville Herskovitz?
No, the Harlem Renaissance original book
Do you mean?
was edited by a white anthropologist. Am I?
You're talking about Melville Herskovitz, but if you mean the New Negro, he did not edit it. I'm sorry to differ, but to my knowledge, Melville Herskovitz did not edit the anthology, The New Negro, which came out of the Survey Graphic of 1925.
Did he introduce it only and not edit it?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, at any rate, he played an important role in terms of...
He did. I don't mean to minimize his influence.
Of distributing the idea of the Harlem Renaissance to begin with.
Yeah.
And then the other image that I have in my mind are the completely black, whether light-skinned or dark-skinned or whatever, performers in the Cotton Club versus the audiences of the Cotton Club, which were mixed men and women and virtually entirely white, or at least identified as white, and possibly sometimes passing.
Right, and not just virtually. The Cotton Club had a whites-only policy. Blacks were not allowed.
But that means
as
that
patrons.
passing is, okay.
Right. Right.
But is either of those things, like Herskovitz's position as a kind of sponsor of blackness, if you will, is that really parallel to what you're talking about with the Miss Anne, or is it entirely different because of gender issues? And then the second thing would be in the...
Because he's a professor. Because he's a professor.
Right, and then you could do the other thing with W.B. Du Bois and his position and his credentials and so on. But and then the audience issue. There's a kind of a longing for blackness, a participation in blackness, but it's temporary and they go back home.
Exactly.
And so on. So I'm just wondering whether there's some deeper parallel with what you're talking about, or whether these are just three different phenomena which really have to be seen distinctly.
So the Vogue phenomenon, the tourist phenomenon, the sort of Saturday night, subway or taxi up to the nightclubs and then going back home, or even the tour guides, which were written for whites. And there was a whole industry of tour guides written just for whites who wanted to experience Black Harlem. I'm sorry? Which Wright also criticizes. And these guidebooks, they're in the basement of the New York Public Library. I mean, they are there to be seen. They're really quite extraordinary. I have images in my book of some of the tourist maps that were constructed for white tourists, and they play. Let me see if I don't think I can get this back up, but they play on just the worst kinds of It's right. People have to buy the book. Okay. We'll make them buy the book. They play on just some of the worst kind of stereotypes you can possibly imagine of African Americans. So that I do treat very much as a separate phenomenon. The question of whether the white male phenomenon, the sort of guides, Herskovitz was one, Carl Van Vechten was another, Alfred Knopf, I mean, you go down the list, the Spingarn brothers, right? Part of the argument of my book is that it was entirely different for white men to be involved in Black Harlem in the way they were, and it had an entirely different effect on Black Harlem, and for white women to be involved. And the reason I insist these are completely different cultural phenomenon with profoundly different effects on the understanding of race which is developed at this time goes back to the question you asked and my discussion about race as a contaminant. The white men, even Herskovitz, who are contributing to black culture, do not forfeit, lose, or risk their whiteness. For men, whiteness is much more stable as a property. Even if they marry black women, they are not seen to forfeit their whiteness. I must have said that backwards. The opposite is true for white women. For white women, whiteness is a highly unstable property. And in a cultural moment in which blackness is seen, again, with Sterling, we're still there, as a contaminant, what it means for white women to do this at risk of forfeiting their own whiteness, which remember means forfeiting their own femininity and womanhood, which essentially leaves them with nothing, right? Because then the only other thing they have is their class status, but because they're women and it's 1920 or 30, most of them don't have access to money in their own name. They get it through their brothers or their fathers. So what it means for white women to do this racial crossover and what it means for white men to do this racial crossover are entirely different. Does that make sense? So that's part of the argument.
Makes sense. It reminds me a lot of the fallen woman phenomenon in Britain in the 19th century, pre-Thomas Hardy, pre-Tessa the D'Urbervilles and things like that.
Let's leave a student to have one last question because we
Sure.
know you have to, if someone to take you to lunch and, but at least you wanted to ask one more question.
Yeah, and a little bit of an observation, I think. Just one of the aspects of being a black person with sort of this dual citizenship, or someone who is considered white, is property and ownership, which goes back to
Yes.
the original relationship in this country between black and white, which is that of master and slave. So by sort of replicating this ownership, and I think this is really interesting with Donald Sterling because it presents a threat. If these black individuals can acquire whiteness, then what's to keep us white? What is the difference? And so he
Exactly.
negotiates the scenario by rising to the highest level, like they call her B, it's his mistress, and she says, do you realize that you own a basketball team with a black head
Right.
coach and black players? Your whole team is black. Like, how could you be a racist? These people are your coworkers. And he says, wrong.
I own them.
I own them. I give them
Exactly.
homes, I give them cars, I give them
Exactly.
jobs. So he has just taken slavery
Exactly.
to its next social level.
Well,
And
as Elgin Baylor said, it was a plantation-style complex.
And he is precisely the logical outcome of America's racial thinking.
it, like,
Precisely.
bears the implications for
Yep.
affirmative action and for equal opportunity in the workplace, that this mentality can survive if there is this sense of providing the opportunity.
Absolutely.
And that's perhaps not going to solve any. I mean, the question is okay, so this is what he thinks. Do we care? I mean, he's a jerk. Do we just let jerks run their mouths? Is he hurting anyone? He's just
But he's not just a
ignorant.
jerk. He's symbolic of so much that
Yeah.
Symbolic of being a
exists is
jerk.
over.
Well-
he is the paradigmatic, racist. But on the other hand, I mean, he happens to not be a good basketball owner. That's just details about his profession. But we're always going to have jerks. Being racist can possibly be like you're sort of getting it out there and letting everyone know.
Yeah.
But is he hurting anyone?
Well, I mean, sure, he's hurt pretty much everybody he's ever come in contact with, and his wife is making a point of making that known. But I know that's not what you meant. But there's sort of two ways of looking at somebody like that. One is you want to isolate them as a supreme jerk, right? And I completely get that move, and obviously he's a supreme jerk. But the other is to resist the move of treating him as exceptional, and to consider the ways, going back to your point, the ways in which he's not an exception to American racial understandings, but may in fact typify a core of American racial understanding that remains with us. The danger of treating him, I think, as just a jerk and just an exception, is as long as we can say none of us are Donald Sterling, not Donald, David, Donald. None of us are Donald Sterling.
David Stern, Donald Stern.
Right, exactly. We get to pretend that he doesn't speak, to steal from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man for any of us on the lower frequencies. And of course he does. On the lower frequencies, he speaks for the nation. And that's why of course he's a jerk, but to me that's sort of besides the point.
He's a class of jerks, meaning surely he's not an individual. He represents a section of society that still has this patriarchal and master-slave type orientation, and yet, as a group, how do those people? Because again, this is sort of a nuanced scenario. This is not your typical, I think, outwardly, harmful and violent, and I mean, is this standard issue racism?
Well, I think it is
categorically different.
Yeah.
Does it have different effects?
I think that's a great closing set of questions.
Yeah.
And let me just suggest that those are just the kind of questions I think we need to be asking now. And just the kind of questions I was hoping my book would contribute to with a long historical lens that allowed us to bring in sort of 6 previously excluded voices, and that I'm hoping people continue to be talking about. I do think there's a real continuum between this question. It's also the stand your ground question. I mean, between these debates and the debates of the 1920s and 30s. So, thank you guys. These were great questions.
Thank you. It was a wonderful talk and a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.